Hi, I'm Gregory Paolini, and in this episode of Table Saw Techniques, I'm going to show you how to make a spline cutting jig for your SawStop table saw. So stick around. One of the most common applications of splines is when you're reinforcing a mitered corner, such as in this little decorative box. Now, mitered corners are pretty much an end grain to end grain joint, and they don't give a lot of good glue surface. The glue joint's actually pretty weak. So by putting a little spline in there, it gives you a lot more long grain glue surface, and it makes a much stronger joint. But in order to safely cut these splines, you'll need a special jig for your SawStop table saw. And it's pretty simple to make, but let me walk through the process with you. Now the runners for this jig are just made out of plywood. These are just scraps I have from other jobs. And they're about 2 inches high. Lengthwise, it's not really critical. These are about 21, 22 inches, somewhere around there. They're both the same length though. That is critical. And they're going to fit into the miter slots. That's what's going to guide the jig that I make. And I'm going to want to mark where the deck of the table saw meets this board. That line is going to be critical for laying out the V cradle. Okay, I'm making a line at the center of my board on its width. And now what I want to do is I want to draw a line at 45 degrees from the line that indicates where the deck of the table saw and the runner come in contact. And I'm just going to make a line there. And then I'm going to flip over onto the other side and make another line. Alright, and now I'm going to want to remove this material here. And I'm going to do that using a miter gauge and a stop block. Alright, next here, I want to tilt my blade to 45 degrees. There we go. And then I want to adjust the height of my blade so that it matches that first line that we put on the runner. That looks pretty close. And to notch this out, I'm just going to use my miter gauge, and I've got an auxiliary fence attached to it for some extra support. I'm just about ready to make my cut. The only other thing I need are safety glasses and hearing protection. I've lined up the layout marks on the runners with the blade, and I'm using a stop block to ensure consistent location and positioning. Make one cut. I flip the piece around, and I make a second cut. There's my V-notch. Now I'm just going to repeat the process on the second runner. And there's my V-notches. That's going to hold the cradle of my jig. And speaking of cradle, let's go ahead and make that. So making the cradle is pretty straightforward. I just need 2 pieces of wood maybe somewhere between 3 or 4 inches in width. And lengthwise, well, all they have to be is just a little bit wider than the distance between the miter slots. In this case, that's 12 inches, so I'll probably look for some pieces that are about 13 or 14 inches long or longer. I keep all of my shorts and drops off to the side, where it's really easy for me to grab them and use them for projects. It's a shame to throw away good pieces like this that could be incorporated into projects. Alright, so I just ripped that piece to about 4 inches in width, and these happen to be about 16 inches in length, so they'll work fine. Next thing I want to do is I want to assemble them at a right angle to one another. So I'm just going to clamp them together and then run a few screws. Now I've avoided putting any screws or fasteners in the center of this piece where it could come in contact with the blade. Now my next step is to just mount the cradle into the runners. So I come back to the saw stop, I lay the runners in place, I put the cradle in, and I want to make sure that it's square. And the easiest way to make sure that this is square is to line up the runners with the edge of the top of my table saw. That's good, and that's a good position right there. This is going to cut good and square. Now I'm just going to run screws through to hold the piece in place. I'm just eyeballing the screw location with the runner here. There we go. Our spline jig's ready for use. What we're going to do is we'll make one cut with the blade at 0 degrees for a straight spline. It's in order to know exactly where the spline's going to be when I'm using it on a project. So making the spline cutting jig is pretty straightforward. But now let's see it in action. So here's a mitered corner. This could be the corner of a decorative box, a drawer, any number of applications. But it's an end grain to end grain joint. And over time it will fail. We'll reinforce that by putting the spline right here. So I'm going to take this piece, set it in the spline cutting jig, and then I'm going to raise my blade until the apex of the blade is just shallow of the inside of the corner. I don't want to cut all the way through. That looks good. Now what I'm going to do, I'll position the piece over the kerf, and I want to hold it in place. So I'm going to use a little clamp here just to keep this from moving. If I had an entire box to do, or 4 corners of a frame, I'd probably clamp a stop block onto this jig. And there's the kerf for my spline cut right through the corner. I've got a lot of long grain exposed in that joint. Now all I have to do is put a spline in it. To finish up the joint, all I have to do is take some long grain hardwood. I'm choosing a contrasting hardwood here. And I just glue it right into the spline. Then I let it dry, and I trim it with a handheld flush cut saw. And that's how simple it is to make and use a spline cutting jig on your SawStop table saw. Be sure to join me again for another episode of Table Saw Techniques.